Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, everybody, welcome to the webinar series for April for SWS. I'm Jeff Trulich. I'll be your facilitator for today. Today's webinar is by Richard Chin. He's going to present us the Clean Water Act rule, real facts. He's with Richard Chin Environmental Training. Next slide, please. Thank you. The housekeeping items. We have the attendee control panel on the right. The panels include audio pane, questions pane, the handouts pane. Today's webinar is attached as a handout under the handouts pane as a PDF. So if you're switching to a phone, enter the audio pin on the control panel that you see there when you logged in. If you have any questions, it'd be awesome to get them as we go along through Richard's presentation, so we have them to kick in right at the end at the Q&A session. So please use the questions pane if you can to submit questions. To ask a question, type it in that box and send it to us, and we'll see it as the presenters. And if you are on Twitter, you may tweet about today's webinar using the hashtag SWS webinar. So our presenter today is Mr. Richard Chin, and I can't see my notes, so I will let Richard Chin kick it off with presenting himself, if that's okay with you, Richard.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks, Jeff. Hi, my name is Richard Chin. I'll be the presenter of this training class, the Clean Water Rule, Real Facts. Let me just go over a little bit about myself so you can kind of get an idea where I stand. I grew up in a household with a mother who was a bookkeeper and a father who was a cook. No science whatsoever in our household. All my siblings went on to be two CPAs and a school teacher, not in science. But for some reason, science gravitated toward me, or I gravitated toward science. Not sure. I have an undergraduate degree from the University of Florida. I have a master's degree with a thesis from the University of South Florida. Both are in zoology. After that, I went to work for a number of state and regional government agencies in the state of Florida. And in 1992, I transitioned into consulting. Did that for a few years, started technical school. And since 1997, I've been doing wetland training under Richard Chin Environmental Training around the country for to over 900 people, I guess, 800 people. I've been dealing with the wilderness rule ever since it came out 2 years ago. I am a lifetime member of the SWS, Professional Wetland Scientist, and if you get a chance, I'd like to see you. I'd like to see you at the annual meeting in Puerto Rico. I'm going to give a presentation there called named "A Quick, Inexpensive Way to Determine Anoxia in Hydric Soils." I think you'll find it to be a useful, innovative method. Oops. Oops. Back. You'll find it to be a useful, innovative way to determine anoxia that is inexpensive, reliable, and I think gluten-free. Not sure about that one though. I'd also like to throw a shout out to and congratulations to Dr. Beth Middleton, the president-elect. I've known Beth for a long time. She'll be a fine president. So if you get a chance, come down to Puerto Rico and see my presentation, get to meet me, and say hello to all the other SWS members. And if today I seem a little giddy, it's because I am in discussions with a publisher about publishing and marketing my novel called The Enemy of My Enemy, a historical fiction novel account of one of the 18 crews of the Doolittle Raid. The Doolittle Raid just celebrated its 70th anniversary last April 18th, a couple weeks ago. So in this class, in this seminar, what we're going to do, the way it's organized, we're going to identify the 8 categories of waters of the United States. Those are fairly straightforward. We're going to go over the exemptions to the waters of the United States. And then we're going to go over something that I think is has not been properly addressed. There has been a just incredible public criticisms of the Clean Water Rule, and I want to bring these up and address some of these on a case-by-case basis. So those are 3 areas that I want to cover in this seminar. And so let's get started. So the first type of waters that we're going to talk about are the ones that are what we call number 1. These go by a lot of different names. They were called these are water bodies that have been jurisdictional basically since the very beginnings of regulation. These are waters that are currently used or were used in the past, or maybe susceptible to use in the future in interstate or foreign commerce, including all waters but just subject to ebb and flow of tide. Some examples of these would be things like Lake Superior, the Ohio River, Mississippi River, Great Salt Lake. And I just want to mention one real quick thing. One example is in 1972, the Edmund Fitzgerald was carrying 26,000 tons of iron ore from some mill in Wisconsin to Cleveland when it sank because of a big storm in Lake Superior. So what do we call 26,000 tons of iron ore going from some mill in Wisconsin to Ohio? Well, it would have to go through Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Erie. All 3 of those water bodies will be considered interstate commerce. Now, even if no iron is not transported from some mill in Wisconsin to Cleveland, the fact that those 3 water bodies were used for interstate commerce makes it a waters of the United States under this very, very standard rule, number 1. So the issue of number 1, water bodies being waters of the United States is well established. And what I described as the rationale, this one goes back to the very beginning to the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause of the Constitution basically says that anything that affects interstate commerce or foreign commerce is regulated by the federal government. So there's not much issue here. The second category of waters in the United States are category number 2. These are intrastate waters. Now, intrastate waters are all the, interstate waters are all the waters, rivers, lakes, and other waters that flow across or form a part of state boundaries, including interstate wetlands. For example, if there were cattail marshes along an interstate water, then that would make it an interstate wetland and also satisfy criteria number 2. An example of the interstate water would be, the great example of this would be the Chattahoochee River, which starts in northeast Georgia. It goes past Atlanta, past Lake, what's it called? Anyhow, it goes past goes past Atlanta, forms a big reservoir right there. You can see in this picture all the places where the river is expanded is because of a dam, a Corps of Engineers dam below that. It angles southwesterly where it joins up with the, where it forms the border between Alabama and Georgia, goes a bit further, and then it forms a border between Georgia and Florida, and then it cuts across the Florida Panhandle where it dumps into Apalachicola Bay. Now, why would this be a water of the United States? Well, this one satisfies a whole bunch of reasons for that. And the thing about the interstate waters is there is a presumption that any water body that flows across state boundaries or forms the boundary of state boundaries has to affect interstate commerce. An example of this I use in my class is Apalachicola Bay, which is in Florida. In 2006, the state of Georgia had a really nasty drought. And the state of Georgia wrote a strongly worded letter to the Corps of Engineers, not asking them, but demanding that they lower the dams below, wherever you see a dam on there, where you see a reservoir, they demanded that the Corps lower those dam levels to the point where that flow would not be wasted in Florida. I'm sorry, they didn't want to lower, they want to raise, I'm sorry. They want those dams raised. They didn't want that water wasted in Florida. Well, if you look at the implications of this, it's actually pretty strong, because as the Apalachicola River flows into Apalachicola Bay is probably the single strongest producer of oysters in the state of Florida. Oysters have one extremely strong limiting factor: predation. They are extremely vulnerable to predation by oyster drills, and the oyster drill the oyster drill and oysters do not have similar urea-healing requirements. The oyster can tolerate lower salinity, the oyster drill cannot. The only way that the oysters are going to survive in Apalachicola Bay is if there is sufficient freshwater flow to lower the salinity to a position where it allows the oysters to perpetuate, but not the oyster drill. If the oysters in Apalachicola Bay were to go extinct because of too little dilution of freshwater from the Apalachicola Bay, which comes from Georgia and forms a boundary of Alabama, then that would make it it would have a detrimental effect on those oysters and also to the states where those oysters are sent. So we see that there's lots of interlapping. It's complicated. There's not just why things are interstate is a very important reason, and it all dates back to the Commerce Clause in the Constitution. Interstate waters have been regulated since. Interstate waters have been assumed to affect interstate or foreign commerce, dating back to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948. So there's not a whole lot of debate about interstate waters. The next ones are the territorial seas. The territorial seas are fairly simplistically the seas that go out to up to 12 miles offshore. Okay, yeah, up to 12 miles, which is defined in the Clean Water Act. And the rationale for these dates back to being a history person that I am. Anyone who's taken my classes knows this. The basis for this dates back to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, when he was Secretary of State under John Adams, sent the Marines to the shores of Tripoli, that's in their anthem, to fight the Barbary pilots. And at that time, he began regulation of territorial seas because of their impacts to foreign commerce, interstate and foreign commerce. So number 3, there's not a whole lot of issues with that one as well. Number 4 is the impoundments. Now, what impoundments are is these are impoundments of waters that are otherwise defined as waters of the United States. And what is not clear in this, and I think the Clean Water Rule probably could have been a little clearer about this. It says that if waters of the United States is impounded, it remains a waters of the United States, but that also very strongly states, well, or maybe not states, suggests that if it is not a waters of the United States and is impounded, then it is still not a waters of the United States. And this has, an example of this would be Chattahoochee River, as I mentioned, has several impoundments along it that the Corps of Engineers regulates. The reason the Corps of Engineers is able to regulate those is because of their impact to interstate commerce. The regulation of impoundments goes back to, I think goes back to the 1982. So there's a long history of regulation of impoundments as well. So those are the first 4. Those are the ones that are, I don't think those get a whole lot of attention because, quite frankly, there's not a lot of debate about those. I don't think I've ever really had too much, anyone really bring up an issue with that those 4 were not justified. And for the most part, they're fairly straightforward. But then we get to, so I do want to mention one thing I saw, and I don't know why. This is about the only time I've ever seen this. But there was one. I did know of one situation where someone argued that the new rule would allow for the regulation of a non-jurisdictional water to become jurisdictional. And what they were basically saying, and let me bring up the actual page that they had. So basically what they were saying is that if a non-jurisdictional water became a waters of the United States, then it wouldn't in turn be waters of the United States. This was by a legal firm, but one of the things I want to mention about this is extremely misleading. First of all, I don't think the rule allows a non-jurisdictional water to become a waters of the United States purely because it was impounded. But what they don't mention in here is they put a little contingent on there that it has to be a navigable in fact water. Well, a navigable in fact water is any water that was determined by a federal court to be a waters of the United States. And so basically any federal court that decides something and says that particular water body is a water of the United States, even if it were not really supposed to be a water of the United States under the rule, well, then it would be. So what this is basically saying is that if the courts do something that is not necessarily what the rule says, then it is. But otherwise, other than that little clause about being navigable effect, no other waters of the United States that was, no other non-waters of the United States that was impounded would become a waters of the United States. So I don't think this is a really big deal for most people. The section, the real fact is the section does not specifically authorize the jurisdiction of non-waters of the United States that are impounded becoming waters of the United States. Their example had a little caveat that it was a navigable effect water. That is a really, really big issue. Then we get to some controversy. Now that we're done with the easy ones, now let's talk about some other stuff. And one that's going to take much of our time today, and depending how much we do in this line of work, is going to consume a lot of our time, and that's tributaries. And what the Clean Water Rule says is very simply all tributaries that meet the definition. So to the casual reader, they're thinking, wow, all tributaries can be waters of the United States. Well, no, when you actually look at the definition in the Clean Water Rule, it goes in great detail about which tributaries actually are going to be waters of the United States. So here's where we get into debate. And the first thing I want to mention is what does the Clean Water Act, Clean Water Rule really say about tributaries? And the first thing I want to mention this, and I want to really emphasize this, is the Clean Water Rule really has 7 very specific requirements to be a tributary. The first is that it have sufficient volume, and I put sick in there. I don't mean to be a grammarist. It's just that the vast majority, well, pretty much everyone who refers to the amount of water flowing through a stream would not use the term volume. They would use the term discharge or volume per time. The reason why they use the term volume, I think, is because Justice Kennedy, in a Rationale decision, used the word volume. And I think what the Corps and the EPA have done since then is just to honor and to acknowledge Justice Kennedy's use of the word volume. But I think what they clearly meant was discharge. So I'm not going to beat that to a horse. But when it says volume, really what it means is based on units. Volume per time is always measured and described in discharge. It must have sufficient frequency. It must have sufficient duration. And what's underlying is the requirement that if you have the discharge, if you have the frequency, if you have duration, which are not necessarily physical features that you're going to see, it will result in some very specific requirements that you will be able to see. A defined bed, which is the bottom part of the stream. Defined banks, which are the sloping parts along the edges. An ordinary high water mark. And the final one is it must drain to a 1, 2, or 3 water. Just to reiterate, the 1, 2, and 3 waters are the waters that affect interstate or foreign commerce. They are territorial seas or they are interstate waters. So it's those 3. They have to drain to an interstate or foreign commerce. They have to affect interstate or foreign commerce. They have to be an interstate water. In other words, they have to either cross state boundaries or form a boundary between states. Or they have to be a territorial sea. So to be a tributary, you have to have these 7 requirements. And there's really no getting around that. Now, what is the rationale for regulating tributaries? The technical rationale for regulating tributaries dates back to the Clean Water Act of 1972. The Clean Water Act very specifically mentions that tributaries would be defined, that they would be regulated. The problem is tributaries were never defined prior to 1972. Oops. Tributaries were never defined prior to the Clean Water Rule. I remember before the Rationale decision, all it said in the rules was that the tributaries were regulated, but it didn't really go into much detail about what a tributary actually was. This was the first attempt by the Corps and the EPA to actually define what a tributary was. The scientific basis for this is pretty strong. The amici curiae, which hopefully everyone has seen, is a legal document put out by basically Friends of Wetlands. That's kind of what it mostly is. It's someone who is a third party. They're not actually within a lawsuit. They're not a petitioner. They're not a respondent. They're not a plaintiff or a defendant. But they want to put in their view. And I'm going to mention them several times throughout here. I'm not going to go into detail about what's in the amici curiae, but it's justified in there. It goes in extensive detail with citations about what the effects of tributaries are on water bodies. So I think the scientific rationale that tributaries should be regulated, I think is a strong one. Later on, when we get into more detail about tributaries and we actually try to define them, then it gets a little slippier as to what technically a tributary should be and what should the requirements of a tributary be. We'll get to that in a few minutes. You will hear arguments that all tributaries will be jurisdictional. I don't know how many times, if I had a nickel for every time I've heard this argument, well, I'd have a lot of nickels. Here's just one example of one. This is put out by, I forget who, but anyhow, it's in their statement. So this is to their clients. They're stating that the waters of the United States will regulate all tributaries of water bodies in the first three categories. That's not true because they don't go into all the other clarifying requirements. They don't mention, for example, that it has to, yes, they do have to flow into a 1, 2, or 3 water. Yeah, acknowledge that. They actually do not flow into number 4. So that's actually, oh, I'm sorry, the first 3, yeah, okay, so, yeah, so they have to flow into first 3, that's true. But they don't have, but they don't have to, but what this doesn't say is that they, oops. But what this doesn't do is go into other details, the other requirements. Just because you flow into a 1, 2, or 3 water, that's one of the requirements. You also have to have the ordinary high water mark, you have to have the bed, you have to have the bank, and then you have to have the underlying discharge requirements, frequency requirements, and duration requirements. So just to say that a tributary that flows into a 1, 2, or 3 water is therefore a tributary, and I think they actually in a previous slide actually emboldened the red to say that all tributaries would be waters of the United States is just not being truthful. That's not a real fact. The real fact is they have to satisfy 7 requirements. Here's another example of an argument that I just picked up. Oops. Oops. Let's see. Okay. The rules can be read to apply to puddles and dry washes. Let's take a closer look at that. The real fact is a dry wash would not satisfy the frequency requirements to be a tributary and would probably not have a persistent bed, bank, or ordinary high water mark. A dry wash, by definition, only flows very irregularly, and the underlying requirement is that they must flow frequently enough to have evidence of a bed, bank, and ordinary high water mark. And we'll even talk about the ordinary high water mark. The amici curiae has found evidence that that's not even something that's found on all tributaries. I don't see how a dry wash would satisfy the underlying requirement for frequency. And as far as the puddles, well, they are a specific example. We'll get to those later. I don't know if that was meant to be in humor or if the person really believed that a puddle could be a waters of the United States. And as you look at this picture right here, I think you can see that this is kind of a dry wash. I don't see any evidence of ordinary high water mark along the sides. And as far as it being flat, yes. I wonder if that's also from people driving on it. There's tire tracks on there. and so possibly it gets a really big flood every so often, every rarely events. It may have the discharge, it may have the duration, but I don't see how it could possibly satisfy the frequency requirements. I don't think that I don't see how a dry wash be able to water the United States and still satisfy the discharge requirements. And the 1.5 watermark would not be expected to persist for very long either. Another one is this one, and what this says is that, and this says that the definition for tributaries covers any water with a bed, banks, and ordinary high water mark that contributes to flow either directly or through another water to traditional navigable water, interstate water, territorial sea, or impoundment. Well, that's not actually correct. It cannot flow to an impoundment. That's one thing that's flat out wrong in the rule. But the other requirement, though, is that tributaries have to so it cannot they actually can't flow to an impoundment. But the other thing is, so they have to have the expressly stated discharge requirements, duration, and frequency. I just don't feel that even if a tributary, in my opinion, in my professional opinion, even if a tributary had a bed, bank, and ordinary high water mark, I do not believe that that satisfies the definition of tributary if it fails one of the other three requirements of frequency, duration, and discharge. The way I read it, and to me it's very clear, that if you have those three things, you will have the bed, bank, and ordinary high water mark. But to me, it's very clear that what's more important is the discharge, frequency, and duration rather than the expressed ordinary high water mark, bed, and bank. So that is my professional opinion on that issue. I don't know if that's a legal decision, but that's my professional, technical, scientific opinion on that. Now, as far as from a technical standpoint, the amici curiae goes into great detail about citing the value of tributaries to downstream waters. I think most of us can probably relate to the idea that upstream waters provide organic matter for downstream critters. It can provide freshwater dilution. There's no question that the Apalachicola Bay is totally dependent upon the upstream waters to dilute the Apalachicola Bay and keep out the oyster drills and allow the oyster population to thrive, which provides interstate commerce for these upstream waters. And from a more legal standpoint or precedent standpoint, the Supreme Court in Riverside Bayview Homes versus the United States in 1985 stated tributaries that impact water quality in the aquatic ecosystem should be regulated. Well, I think most scientists would agree that tributaries do affect the water quality in the aquatic ecosystem of the receiving body of water downstream. So that's totally consistent with those. Then we get to another complicated subject, adjacency, and we're going to see that waters that are adjacent to a 1, 2, or 3 waters of the United States. So these are the waters of the United States that affect interstate or foreign commerce, or that or that are interstate waters or are territorial seas. If any water that's adjacent to one of these three is in itself a waters of the United States. So if it's adjacent to a 1, 2, or 3 waters of the United States, it would therefore be a waters of the United States itself, unless it's been exempted for some reason, in which we'll go over those in a few minutes. The distances for adjacency is something that were never defined before, and so someone had to do it. And that someone was the Corps and EPA. Someone had to do it. They did. The rationale for regulation of the waters for adjacent waters also dates back to 1985 with the Riverside Bayview SCOTUS, or Riverside Bayview Supreme Court decision of 1985, when they unanimously confirmed that wetlands adjacent to a waters of the United States are indeed a waters of the United States. That was unanimous. I don't think we've seen a unanimous decision in the Supreme Court for quite some time. So that was something they thought about, that they thought very strongly about, should be. The technical rationale for regulating adjacent water bodies is documented in the amici curiae. One quote that they say in there is, I think it's wraps this up very clearly. The best available science supports clean water rules, categorical treatment of adjacent waters based on geographic proximity. So I think that's pretty straightforward how their view is. So that brings us up to number 7. Number 7 is going to have relatively little impacts because it only pertains to 6 water bodies. But these are 6 water bodies that they're all going to be, well, I can't think of any exception. These are going to be isolated wetlands, and as probably most of you know, the wetlands were mostly deregulated by the Swank decision of 2001, by the Supreme Court Swank decision, when they said that any wetland whose interstate commerce nexus was only the migratory birds that potentially or were or are in them, they ruled that out. They did not let the regulation of isolated wetlands be waters of the United States from the Swank decision solely because of birds. Now, that doesn't mean that isolated wetlands can't be waters of the United States, but it can't be because of interstate commerce impacts from the presence of birds. However, what the Swank decision did not address was adjacent wetlands and how these isolated water bodies can affect other water bodies if they have a significant nexus. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about significant nexus, and we'll talk about that in definitions. But right now, let's just think of what this generally means. So we have these 6 types. We have these 6 types of water bodies. And I'm not going to go into much detail about them. I just want to give you a real quick gloss over. Prairie puddles are in the upper Midwest states. These were caused during the last glacial period. Glaciers came down, scoured low depressions, and became mostly isolated wetlands. The Carolina Bays and Delmarva Bays formed from mostly from, well, in my opinion, meteorite strikes, although some people think they came from some other sources like whales. Precocins are isolated wetlands in Carolina Bays are found in Carolinas, South Carolina, North Carolina. Delmarva Bays, based on their name, are found in Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Precocins are found in the coastal plain states, along with a lot of places where the Carolina Bays and Delmarva Bays are found. They are isolated wetlands with organic soils. The vernal pool wetlands, and they only regulate the western vernal pool wetlands. They ignore the Midwestern ones, like, for example, ones that I go to in Columbus, Ohio, and the ones in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. So they're only mentioning the western vernal pool wetlands. And then finally, the Texas coastal prairie wetlands. So these can be waters of the United States if they have a significant nexus to a water that affects interstate or foreign commerce, interstate waters, or territorial seas. In other words, the first 3 categories that we mentioned. And this is one where the Clean Water Rule does address cumulative impacts. They refer extensively to similarly situated waters are to be assessed for cumulative impacts. The rationale for these is the whole concept of significant nexus was developed during the Rationale decision, especially by Justice Kennedy. I think he was the main one who referred to significant nexus, and so there's been history behind the regulation of wetlands that had a significant nexus to other water bodies based on that. The scientific rationale for this is based on the fact that one water body can have a significant nexus on the other. The amici curiae addresses this extensively, but I do want to mention one thing about significant nexus. It's a two-way street. A water body can have a positive significant nexus to the receiving body of water downstream, or it can have a negative effect. In either case, it's significant. So it can be significantly positive, or it can be significantly negative. in both cases is significant. Now, as far as these number 7 goes, this is not going to be a really big issue in a lot of places. They're only found in certain states. They're generally going to be isolated wetlands, and quite frankly, they're not going to have significant nexus to very many other water bodies. Number 7 is probably going to be a relatively limited use within the Clean Water Act or Clean Water Rule. Many of these are protected by state rules. Prairie potholes in Minnesota, vulnerable wetlands in California, the coastlands in Delmarva Bays and the Carolina Bays in North Carolina would be generally picked up by the state. South Carolina would not regulate Carolina Bays, and unfortunately North Dakota does not have a state rule, and they have extensive prairie potholes which are in jeopardy as we speak. They're generally intrastate, which means that they are not going to be they're not going to be picked up by number 2, which is interstate waters and interstate wetlands. And because of the Swank decision of 2001, they did have extensive bird use between them, but Supreme Court has spoken, and they said that's not an issue, and so we have to just live with that. And these, from my experience, working extensively with prairie potholes, or not prairie potholes in North Dakota, Minnesota, vulnerable wetlands in California, Texas coastal prairie wetlands. As a general rule, a lot of these will not have a significant nexus to a 1, 2, or 3 water body. That's just the reality. Those that do will be regulated under number 7, but this is not going to be a very common issue in my opinion. Which brings us up to number 8. Now, number 8 is probably the most complicated one, but it's also one of the most useful ones. What number 8 says is water bodies that satisfy 2 requirements. There's 2 ways that you can satisfy number 8. The first one is by any waters within 100-year floodplain, but also any waters within 4,000 feet of the high tide line or near high water mark of a water that affects interstate foreign commerce, interstate waters, territorial seas, impoundments, and tributaries. In other words, all 5. But, and this is something that people forget, and when people refer to number 8 being all-encompassing, I heard one politician, I won't mention who, say that because of this, any water body within 4,000 feet is going to be a waters of the United States. And that's not true. Because what they have to have, in addition to satisfying the first two requirements of either being within 100-year floodplain or being within 4,000 feet of the ordinary high water mark or the high tide line of one of these 5 water bodies, more importantly, they still have to satisfy a significant nexus to a 1, 2, or 3. So that is a very strong underlying requirement. This is not going to be the big overreach grab that I've heard people argue this will lead to. I don't see that happening. Now, if any part of that water body is within, for example, 4,000 feet and has a significant nexus, then if any part of that water body extends into that, then the entire water body would be jurisdictional. Makes perfect good sense to me. If, let's say, part of a water extends into 4,000 feet, and therefore that part has a significant nexus, and therefore it's a water of the United States, that water within that water body can circulate throughout the rest of the water body. I see no reason why the whole water body would not be jurisdictional. I've heard people argue that the line of jurisdiction should be cut off at that 4,000 feet, which would be extremely artificial and would not address water movement throughout the rest of that water body, and also amphibian movement and fish movement and things like that, and pollutant movement and chemical movement, etc. It seems only natural that you would have to include the entire water body if any part of it is jurisdictional. The rationale for number 8 is that the plurality of Rapanos supported the regulation of isolated interstate wetlands that had a significant nexus to a waters of the United States. They did not address distances. Someone had to come up with distances, and that was the EPA and the Corps in the Clean Water Rule. So that was the first time that the distances were actually addressed. So that's where we got those numbers from. The scientific rationale is also in the MT Curie. They discuss that extensively and have no problems finding finding data indicate that the significant nexus is a scientifically valid idea. So those are the 8 types of waters in the United States. Now let's go into what the definitions are. We'll cover the definitions. Oops. And so the first thing first 3 definitions we have are the definition of adjacent is bordering or contiguous or neighboring. And before the Panos decision, that's what we use, just those 3 terms, bordering, contiguous, or neighboring. And it was not defined as to what, well, bordering or contiguous were mostly defined, but neighboring was not. So someone had to come up with what the definition of neighboring is, and that someone was the EPA and the Corps in the Clean Water Rule. But our first definition is bordering and contiguous, which I've always argued. Again, I'm not a linguist, but I've always thought in my crude mind that bordering and contiguous are synonymous. Yet I don't know why they have 2 words. So bordering and contiguous are synonymous. In the Panos decision, I think it was Justice Kennedy used the term abutting. Personally, I think that's a better term. They went back to using the term bordering and contiguous in the Clean Water Rule, even though it was used by even though it was used there. I will mention that in his dissent, Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, said that to be adjacent, you would have to be there would have to be a contiguous, permanent water connection between a 1, 2, or 3 water, let's say a water body affects interstate commerce, and the adjacent water. So, for example, let's say that there's a wetland 10 feet away, separated by a levee, and during high flood events, that the connection between that wetland and that levee is breached, and there's a physical connection at that point. But because most of the time, or at least at times, there is no permanent connection, therefore would not be a waters in the United States. Scalia, that was Scalia's argument. The plurality said no, they do not have to have a permanent continuous water connection, and that's what stood. So that's the definition. That's where we start with adjacent. The problem with adjacent is bordering and contiguous are, except for a little issue about the permanent water, the definition of abutting is or bordering and contiguous is not too much a problem, not too problematic. The big issue is with neighboring. What is the definition of neighboring? Well, what the Corps did is they went by what the research indicated from results like the MQ Curie, and they came up with different requirements. And the first one is all waters within 100 feet of the ordinary watermark of a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 waters. Those are the first 5 categories of waters in the United States. The second category are, The second category are all waters within the 100-year floodplain of a water that affects the interstate or foreign. So they have to be within the 100-year floodplain of these 5 types of water bodies. But there is a limitation that they be no more than 1,500 feet from the ordinary watermark of such water. The MQ Curie did not even feel that 1,500, the 1,500-foot limitation was appropriate. That was artificial. In my opinion, the 1,500-foot distance that they came up with is purely political for political expedience. That's what I think. So anyhow, that's what it is. So there's a 1,500-foot limitation even within 100-year floodplain. So not everything within 100-year floodplain is going to be jurisdictional. It would be limited to 1,500 feet of that. Then the third category, letter C, is all waters within 1,500 feet of the high tide line of a 1, 2, or 3 water. And then what I call D, because I don't know why they lumped the Great Lakes in with the saline waters, the tidal waters, but so I would call it D, all waters within 1,500 feet of the ordinary high water mark of a Great Lake, the 5 Great Lakes. I guess it's 5, yeah, 5. Can't remember if yeah, there was an issue with the Vermont water at one point. And just like before, the entire water is jurisdiction of any port extents within those 4 categories, A, B, C, or D. Just like before, there is no reason to think that the water will not circulate between them. And so if any part is within that, then well, pretty much everything should be waters in the United States. The rationale for regulating neighboring waters is Riverside Bayview Supreme Court case in 1985 unanimously supported regulation of adjacent wetlands. It did not address distances. So that was something that someone had to do that, and that someone was the Corps and EPA. From a scientific standpoint, the MQ Curie clearly supports the argument of adjacent wetlands, except they go one step further and say the 1,500-foot limitation is not based on science, but was for, well, they don't say why, but I think it was for political reasons. That's my opinion. So those are definitions of adjacent. Then we get to definitions of tributaries. And first of all, let's just define a tributary that flows eventually to a 1, 2, or 3 water body. Now, it can flow through an impoundment, but the tributaries, as I mentioned, state you have to have a bed, bank, and ordinary high water mark. But then it says implicitly that they also have to have the sufficient duration, frequency, and discharge of flow to create a bed, banks, and ordinary high water mark. I don't see how, by reading the definition, that you can say that a tributary that lacked the duration or frequency or duration could be a waterside states, in my opinion. Tributaries can be natural. They can be man-altered, man-made waters. Man-made waters would be canals and ditches. And the history of the regulation of tributaries goes back for quite some time. We'll get to that in just one second. Some tributaries can also be discontinuous. They can have constructive breaks. They can be natural breaks. A constructive break would be, for example, a culvert going across a stream. Across a stream. They can have natural breaks. A natural break example would be where a stream flows through a wetland on its way to on the way downstream. And it will still be a waterside states if it flows through a non-waterside states or a non-tributary waterside states, for example, a wetland. The rationale for regulating tributaries dates back to 1977 with the original Clean Water Act. So these have been around for a long time. And as far as the technical rationale for regulating tributaries is strongly supported by the MQ Curie. To me, it's why even discuss this. This is such an obvious thing that tributaries should be regulated. One thing I do want to mention about tributaries, which I don't think that the Clean Water Rule went into enough detail about, and I think in some ways it possibly could have had another requirement to be another way to regulate them, is cumulative impacts. And I think about a single stream flowing down a hillside, eventually going into Cockroach Bay. That single stream, in and by itself, if it were filled, rerouted, impacted, heavily grazed, scoured, etc., damaged, would probably not have a big impact on the receiving body of water downstream. But if every stream was impacted the same way, the cumulative impact would be tremendous. They do mention cumulative impacts in some other situations, but I don't think they mentioned it enough. The definition of wetlands is unchanged. I think this is the same definition that's been used. It goes back to, well, ever since I started doing these, ever since I've gotten to wetlands business in 1987. That was the definition we always used. Maybe it was different before that. One of the last definitions we're going to see is significant nexus. Significant nexus is there's one water body, how one water body can affect another water body. And by saying alone, by saying alone or in combination, it doesn't use the terms cumulative impacts, but I think it's real clear that that's what they're implying. So maybe one wetland next to a stream would not have a significant nexus, but if you put all the wetlands next to a stream and looked at their total impact, then the impact would be the cumulative impact would be significant. So it does not have to be just that particular wetland or wetland that impacts something. It could be the cumulative impact. Some examples of significant nexus. These are all pretty standard things. I think when you look at we just kind of think about what wetlands do. Most of these things are kind of wetland related, more so than, say, for example, streams. well, contribution flow, but they tend to be kind of stream wetland oriented. And one thing I want to mention about these is one example that I always talked about in my classes is I always show this. Oops. Oh, oops, got to hit myself. The rationale for significant nexus is the concept of significant nexus. Oops. Oh, the rationale for significant nexus was introduced by Swank and repeated by Kennedy and Rapanos. The technical data clearly supports the validity of significant nexus. Not much issue, not much debate within the amicus about the role of significant nexus and its impacts on downstream waters. And again, the significant nexus could be either positive or it could be negative. A couple other definitions I want to mention is the ordinary high watermark and high tide line. I'm not going to go into details about what they are. Just want to kind of show you a couple pictures of them. But the ordinary high watermark is physical evidence that the water got to a certain level and had the duration, frequency, and discharge to leave behind a physical mark. Mean high tide line would be not mean high tide. High tide line would be the water coming up and leave behind things like fine line of shells, seagrasses, things like that. And over the next couple minutes, I just want to go briefly over some exemptions. Most of these are fairly straightforward, but the exemptions come in three categories. There are exemptions to waters of the United States that are inherent in the Clean Water Act. There are exemptions of waters of the United States that are inherent in some other law, and then there are policy decisions. And I don't think I've ever heard one of a critic of the Clean Water Rule say, "Oh, but I'm opposed to the number of things that they expanded in the exemptions." I don't think I've ever heard that argument from a critic of the Clean Water Rule. So these are the exemptions, things that are not waters of the United States. Some of these are either within the Clean Water Act, they're within some other law, or they're policy. Waste treatment systems were never regulated under the Clean Water Act. They've always been exempted. Priority croplands were never regulated or have not been regulated since 1985. They're basically grandfathered in. These were wetlands that were dewatered for agricultural production. They have always been exempt under the Food Security Act of 1985. No change there. Then there's these ditches, and they refer to three ditches. Ones that have ephemeral flow. Well, in my opinion, if you have ephemeral flow, you don't satisfy the duration. If you're intermittent, you probably don't satisfy duration. And if you don't end up in a 1, 2, or 3, you definitely do not satisfy the duration. I don't think that the Clean Water Rule even had to list these as exemptions, because none of these satisfy the definition of tributary, in my opinion, in the first place. But yet they specifically exempted them in the list. There are some other exemptions for ditches that are exempted in the Food Security Act. There's various agricultural production exemptions. So if you go into agriculture actions, there's other stuff that's exempted that's not actually listed in the Clean Water Rule. I don't know why they didn't, but they're actually exempted by other agriculture laws. But the Clean Water Rule did not address. And some other things that were by policy. These were things that the Corps never regulated, but it was not actually in the Clean Water Act. Artificially irrigated areas that would revert to dry land should application water area cease. For example, a pipe that leaks out water in Hillsborough County and under which, over the course of 20 years of leaking, a bald cypress, carex, hydric soils form, and it's wet. It's a wetland, but it's not a water of the United States, because once they fix the pipe, it would dry out and no longer be a water of the United States. So they were not regulated. Artificial constructed lakes and ponds created for farm. This is for a farm exemption. Ponds and lakes, but they had to be created in dry land. They were specifically exempted, and that was also a carryover from before. Artificial reflecting pools or swimming pools, and artificial reflecting pools are like the Washington Mall. Swimming pools are actually exempt because there are some swimming pools that are created that are excavated to be like natural pools. So actually that was taken into account, the new technology. Small ornamental waters like koi ponds that are created in dry lands. And then one thing that the Corps actually is changed kind of substantially, at least here in Florida, is water fill depressions creating dry land instead of mining. That's what we call borrow pits. in Florida, borrow pits used to be regulated if they had an opportunity to evolve into a lake. The Corps used the term abandoned mined areas and very often regulated those. If it had been mined recently, it would be a non-abandoned mined area, and that would have been accepted. Example of artificial reflecting pool, also 9/11 Memorial and Oklahoma City Memorial are two other ones. Small ornamental ponds like this little koi pond, borrow pits, and then a couple other non-waters, erosional features. In the Raponos decision, it said that these erosional features could. It said they were generally not regulated, but it did not leave out that possibility that they could be. Now they're saying they are actually completely non-regulated because they probably fail bend and bang. They probably fail certainly duration, probably frequency, probably discharge. So examples of erosion features are no longer regulated. And one senator, I won't mention his name, held up when the Clean Water Rule came out, proposed Clean Water Rule came out, he held it up and said, now they're going to be regulating puddles in my driveway. Well, I don't think they are. And then the last two are actually redundant. Well, groundwater was something that was is a new concept. There is one exception. Groundwater within wetlands would still obviously be regulated. And then two other ones, which are just basically a reworking of the first one, stormwater control features and wastewater control features. And that's it. Jeff?
All right. Thank you for that good information. Now we'll move into some of our questions and answers real quick. I got one that's real close to your heart there, Richard. Where's the link? Where can we find that amici curiae brief? Is there a link on the internet that we can provide folks?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head.
Well, we can find that probably and let folks know. Maybe post it with the materials or something.
Yeah. I don't know exactly where, but yes, it is available.
Okay. Another question: do you know why the Salton Sea is considered water of the U.S.? Is it what category that you went over would the Salton Sea in California fall under? Well,
the Salton Sea originally, historically, was like the Great Salt Lake in that it was not a water of the United States. And at that point, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. The Salton Sea, like the Great Salt Lake, was originally an isolated water body. And I don't know, it'd be questionable whether that was a water of the United States. But now that the Colorado River was diverted and goes into it, then it really makes it part of the Colorado River. So it would fall in a category of an abutting water body to a international water, the Colorado River.
Okay. Let me see. Do we know the impact of the most recent presidential executive order on waters of the U.S.?
The presidential directive was very straightforward and very simplistic. It was basically get rid of it. As to how it's actually how you get rid of a rule that actually was fully implemented. It went to full implementation. It was published in the Federal Register, I think, in May of 2015. It was fully implemented, I think, 90 days later, so May, August, I think October or August. It was fully implemented. And then it was suspended by the courts, by first one court and then the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. The presidential executive directive basically just tells his staff to get rid of it. That's a way more complicated process than what the executive directive really means. I'm not an attorney. I don't know how these things work, but my reading of it is that it would actually have to. It's a much larger process than what it seems like on the face.
Okay. Is there multiple questions here about? Is there good sources for providing the definitions for sufficiency, frequency, duration, volume? Are those in the Clean Water Act rule that's in existence right now that we reverted to? Are they in the brief somewhere, or are there information on regulatory's website maybe for EPA and the Corps?
if you, no, let me rephrase that. The amici brief does not go into details, at least now maybe some of the references. Okay, if you actually get into the references of the amici, maybe you can find what actual discharge numbers it should be, what the frequency should be, what the duration should be. But the clean water rule just says no. It has to have sufficient discharge, frequency, and duration to create bed and bank and ordinary high water mark. So that's probably going to be the next big thing that we're going to be seeing erupting down the road. So the answer to your question is no, it doesn't really go into details. It'd be nice if everything was defined that clearly, but it's not.
Okay.
But it's one of those things where you kind of know it when you see it, though. At least
Right.
I think I do. I think I do, or I'd like to think I do.
So, okay, do you know the specific, is there a specific process for raising and resolving conflicts or differences of jurisdiction, especially when we're reverting to the Rapanos rule? In the interim, is there an appeals process for jurisdictional calls that are made by the government?
Yeah, that's always been part of the core regulatory program, that there are appeals processes. Right now, with the clean water rule being suspended, then what the Corps has basically done is reverted back to the Rapanos guidance of 2008. But yeah, there's always been an appeals process where if you feel that the Corps has not followed the guidance properly, you can appeal that. You can appeal that decision. And that's always been in there. The clean water rule doesn't really address that. That's more of a how the Corps regulates things rather than what they regulate.
Right. Okay. Let me see here. So a question about ephemeral streams in Kansas. Out here in Kansas, many farm ponds are created by low dams on creeks. Many are ephemeral streams. I thought ephemeral streams could be considered to have significant nexus. How does this fall into these categories you laid out when you have say an agriculture pond being built across an ephemeral stream in the Midwest? Okay,
well, again, every stream is going to have to, okay, so they're excavating an existing stream in Kansas, okay, for an agricultural purpose. There is an exemption for ponds, but not if it's in a waters of the United States in the first place. So you can't dig a pond in a existing regulated tributary and call it a farm pond. I mean, it is, but it's not exempted. Okay, so I want to just touch on that for a second. The other thing is that tributary, for that stream to be a jurisdictional water, would fall in the category of tributary. So that tributary would have to meet all the 7 requirements I mentioned before. It would have to have the bed and bank. It would have to have an ordinary high water mark. It would have to have sufficient flow. Now, as a general rule, the course that basically said that man-made ditches that are ephemeral are not regulated. The tributary, naturally occurring tributaries, have a lower standard of duration, frequency, and discharge than do man-made ditches. I don't think it would be beyond the realm of possibilities for even an ephemeral stream that has enough flow in it, even though it's short-lived, and eventually goes into a 1, 2, or 3 to be considered a waters of the United States. Therefore, that pond that would be excavated within that stream would require a permit in the first place, and therefore would be jurisdictional, in my opinion.
Okay. I'm trying to sift through some of these other questions we had coming in here. There's a lot of good ones. Someone posted in one of the question boxes, they posted the link from one of the law websites for the amicus brief that you were talking about, so we can get that posted probably in association with the content for this webinar.
Good.
Let me see here. Still a lot of questions about the definitions. Are there definitions still out there in the rule that we reverted to about Ordinary High Water Act and the discharge and how that flows into another tributary, which then flows into a 1, 2, and 3, and how the jurisdictional progression goes through those tributaries. Are those all in that old rule that we fell back to, or is that like guidance that someone would have to ask their local regulatory office about?
Yeah, in Rapanos? Yeah, Rapanos did address tributaries. And actually, off the top of my head, I've been so focused on the clean water rule. Let me think for a second. Oh yeah. Okay, so the Rapanos said that basically the same thing that they're saying now. A tributary that flows, a tributary that is not in itself a 1, 2, or 3. So let's say it's a little thing that just supplies water into another water body that eventually goes down into a 1, 2, or 3, and then as receiving body water. So yes, they can be jurisdictional. That upstream, let's say it's a third order stream, would have to have a significant nexus to the receiving body of water downstream. And that's one thing. And that's one thing that I mentioned I don't think the clean water rule really. Maybe I just missed it, but the clean water rule, in my opinion, did not go into more detail about cumulative impacts of streams. You know, here in Florida, we have a very clear cumulative impacts on NPDES permitting. So, for example, if a single person discharges into a stream, it's not going to do that much damage. But if that person does that and 16 other million people do that in Florida, then the impact is going to be substantial. And so that's where that whole concept of significant nexus comes into play. Significant nexus does address, it does kind of address cumulative impacts, but I wish they would actually use the words cumulative impact. But right. But the definition of significant nexus does, I think, incorporate that. I just wish it would be more explicit.
Okay, I have a quick question here. Can a subsurface connection to a navigable waters cause a wetland to be jurisdictional? I'm assuming that would be close to it or abutting it or adjacent to the navigable waters, but does it need a surface connection? I guess if it's adjacent and there's uplands in between, the adjacency rule takes into effect, not necessarily a connection by groundwater?
Okay, so they connected a non-jurisdictional wetland to a stream?
No, it sounds like kind of a wetland that's adjacent to a navigable waterway.
Yeah.
If a groundwater connection makes it jurisdictional.
Oh, I see. Okay, this is a little fuzzy. Historically, after the Swank decision, the Corps put out a notice saying that no, that groundwater connections did not satisfy the abutting requirement, and they don't. Okay, I think let's go and address that right there. So if a wetland is connected to a stream through groundwater, then it would not be considered abutting. I think that's pretty standard, but it would still be potentially neighboring, which is the other aspect of adjacency. So, right. So I would think that stream, that wetland would still be a waters of the United States, not because it's connected by groundwater, but because of its proximity to the stream. Now, if it was connected by some, and by groundwater, I mean it has to be, it's groundwater from the wetland to the stream. There are some options for tributaries to have surface water that goes below ground and then comes back to surface. So I think we're talking about just primarily groundwater. And so the answer is no, it would not be abutting, but yes, it would probably be neighboring and therefore still adjacent, in my professional opinion.
Okay. So there's a question here. I'm not sure. I know I'm not read up on it. I don't know if you are aware of it or read up on it. What would the implications be of the recent judgment in Des Moines, I'm assuming Iowa, waterworks and farm runoff? I don't know if you know anything about a court decision, I guess, in Des Moines, Iowa, and farm runoff?
No, I don't. But that sounds more like an NPDES thing rather than a Waters of the United States thing.
Right.
Okay.
I
mean, no, so no, I'm not familiar with that one. No.
All right. I think we've gone through quite a few of the questions that we had. Unless someone else has one, I think we could probably thank you, Richard, for your detailed presentation. And if anyone else, certainly keep typing your questions. We could probably pull them off of the website and maybe have Richard follow up specifically with you if we didn't get to some of them or if we didn't answer them as completely as you need. So thank you, Richard, for your presentation. It was great, very informative on where we are right now, as of today, with jurisdictional issues.
Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me.
Sure. Our next webinar in the webinar series is May 18th. It's on using sediment enhancement to build tidal wetland resiliency on Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland, in the United States. It's by Matt Whitbeck. He's with the Refuge Complex. Some of you, if you go online, you can see the thin layer spraying they did. They did a pretty large placement and associated with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, I believe, on a dredging job that they were doing in the river adjacent to the Wildlife Refuge Marsh. So please tune in if you can on May 18th for that. It should be informative on how that department or that refuge is dealing with sea level rise issues along Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. And of course, in June, we will have our annual meeting for SWS in Puerto Rico. So the Sheraton Puerto Rico Hotel located next to the meeting location. You can get an SWS discount there. And Umberto the Frog would like to see you there. So the deadline for booking rooms is May 2nd, coming up on May 2nd. So over the weekend, if you have some time and if you're thinking about it, maybe book a flight to Puerto Rico and a hotel for participate in the SWS conference, annual conference. And with that, I think we'll wrap up for the day. Thanks for everybody joining in. Have a good day.
Thank you, Jeff.